With this introduction, I would like to call upon my friend John Pyra, who's going to talk on AI, geopolitics, and national security.
So I really appreciate you giving them a bit of history, which I think provides a good context for the talk today. I like the idea that you had in terms of the element of risk and how it compared to the atomic bomb. I would guess that the 1 in 3 million, I think you said, chance was actually higher in the sense that if you thought about the potential for a nuclear war, rather than just setting the atmosphere on fire, it was probably more like 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100. But anyway, Mark mentioned that some of the AI experts mentioned that we have like a 5 to 10% chance that this technology could kill us, which was something that was going through my mind as I prepared today's presentation, because I was trying to think of a way of ending on a positive note. So maybe if I start with like the really bad stuff first and it just gets moderately better, that will seem like a good way to end things. So my path to you today is a relatively long and twisted one. I'm a local boy. I went to UBC, got recruited by CSIS, and ended up working for the BC Securities Commission at one point in my middle of my career. I did something I never thought I would do and go back to Ottawa and worked for a brand new federal agency called FinTrack. Anybody know what that does? Can I hear it? What? Yeah?
Oh, you want me to?
Yeah. What do you...
So FinTrack's responsible for the tracking of financial flows to look for money laundering.
For money laundering, exactly, yeah. So that was a really interesting place. I really enjoyed being there at the start of a brand new agency. It was sort of like a field of, you know, undisturbed snow of data there that you could work with, and that was a lot of fun for me. I did a brief stint in academia, where I was a visiting scholar at Carleton, and then I had a chance to go back and be at the Privy Council office, which was a pretty big deal for me, because that's sort of the peak of our intelligence community. All the stuff that we collect is filtered upward through the PCO to the Prime Minister. So I got to get a relatively high view of all that. So you don't have to remember all that alphabet soup of acronyms. But I wanted to mention that just so that you're clear on my perspective on this. I'm a guy that's used to doing threat assessments, threats to the security of Canada. So that's primarily the lens that I look at when I think of issues like AI. This is I don't know if you can see it in the back, that's the CSIS building on a beautiful spring day in Ottawa. My wife took that picture as I was coming out of the building, and I always thought, you know, one day I'll retire back to BC, and I'll have a display case in the front foyer of my house with my mukluks and my parka, and I'll tell people that that's actually what I wore to work every day, and they won't believe me. So this is the fourth in a series of lectures. If you've been to them all, we had Eric talk about sort of the basics, the vocabulary of this topic. Then we had Oscar talk about some of the tools and some of the interesting things that are out there. Joanna talked about the ethical considerations. And today I'm talking about geopolitics and national security. So hopefully I can do that justice. I've organized this talk into 3 parts. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the 2 big concerns that you always run across whenever you start learning about AI. And then I'm going to talk about 4 schools of thought, and finally wrap up with 5 different scenarios for the future. And what I thought would be fun for you, what I hope will be fun for you, or at least interesting, is that as I go through this, I'm kind of going to pull back the curtain a little bit, and I'm going to show you how an intelligence analyst would approach dealing with this issue and analyzing this and forecasting the future. And maybe you'll find that interesting. Maybe you'll find a few tricks in there that you'd like to use yourself. So let's start with our first part, the 2 big concerns. Whenever you read about AI or watch videos on YouTube, you'll probably come across these. The first one is, will it have our values and goals? So that comes up all the time, and typically what you'll hear is some people feel that yes, it'll be a mirror that reflects us, so it'll be aligned with us. And others worry that it will be unaligned, that it will develop independent values and goals. The second one relates to restraint and whether our guardrails will hold. So some people feel that as we build this, we'll be able to build in adequate safeguards. Others feel that at some point it may escape our grasp, get beyond our control. So as you consume material about AI, I think it's helpful to keep these two key concerns in question. Whenever you hear somebody talking about the subject, you could probably put them at one end of the spectrum or the other on these two main concerns. Now, what's interesting to do is to take these two concerns and to use them to create different scenarios. So let's say that I take that first one, the idea that AI could be either controlled or uncontrolled, and I put that along the horizontal axis. And then I take the second one, the idea of AI having values and goals, and I put that in a vertical axis. So what I've done is I've created 4 different scenarios. And let me just walk you through this. So in the upper left corner, scenario number 1, we have AI that's under our control and that's aligned with our values and goals. So I call that particular scenario the helpful oracle. So that's really the best case scenario. Over on the right-hand side, we have an AI that's aligned with our goals, but it's not totally under our control. So this might be an AI that has hallucinations or tries to get out of the sandbox that it's in or something of that nature, or tries to perpetuate existence when we're trying to shut it down. I call this one the overly eager but incompetent assistant. Over in the left corner, lower left, we have it's under our control, but it's not aligned with our values. So that's an interesting one to think about. I mean, there we've basically got it in a box. It's like having a guard dog on a chain or something like that, right? So it's there, it's doing its job, but if we let it go, we're not quite sure what it will do, right? It might just head off into the woods, or it might chew your leg off. Now, there's a really interesting term that they have in the industry for this one. It's kind of spooky. The chained god. Now, the worst case scenario is definitely the one in the lower right corner. That's where AI is not under our control and it doesn't have our values and goals. So this is really the doomsday scenario. And I tried to think of a sort of a nice way to kind of compress this down. And I thought, well, it's kind of like being in a taxi with a drunk driver. And you don't know where he's going and you can't really influence what he's doing, right? You might get where you're going, but you know, it could also end in disaster. Donald Trump, yeah. So we've got 4 different scenarios, and just to recap, what have I done? And, you know, this is part of the way that analysts think about the future. We think about drivers. This is actually a technique out of a book called Structured Analytic Techniques. This is the Bible for intelligence analysts. And what you do is, if you're thinking about the future and you're trying to come up with something better than, well, the worst case is this, the best case is that, and you want a little bit more nuance, a little bit more variety to it, you think about the drivers that are shaping that future. So let's say, just as an example, you're thinking of moving away to be closer to the grandkids, right? And you're trying to decide, is that a good thing or a bad thing? How would that work out? Well, one of the things might be the cost of doing that. So it might be high, it might be low. The other thing might be your health. It could be good, it could be poor. So right away, you can see how you've created 4 different futures using those 2 factors, right? So analysts think like this all the time. We're always doing these kinds of things, using it as an exercise, trying to provoke us to think about things that we wouldn't normally think about, and delving into those different scenarios. So back to the 4 that I talked about. Another interesting way for you to look at this is to think about the type of people that you encounter in each one of these quadrants. So if we look at the helpful oracle, top left, these are people that think AI is going to be under our control and it's going to be aligned. So you could say that these people are likely to be optimists. They basically argue that the benefits will outweigh the risks. On the other side, we have ethicists. Maybe not a great choice of term, but they're people that feel that AI will be aligned, but not necessarily under our full control. So it's really a matter of just getting the rules right, getting the controls right, so that it does what we want it to do. But they think it's a manageable problem. In this lower corner, you might encounter skeptics that feel that there's an AI bubble, that it's mostly hype, that, yeah, we'll be able to control it, because really, at the end of the day, it's not going to be as dramatic or exciting as we think it will be, but there could be some issues where it doesn't actually perform as well as we think it would be. So these people would be saying, yeah, it's going to be a niche thing. It'll be really good for logistics, it'll be great for diagnosing breast cancer and all these other sort of really specific applications, but it will never sort of grow beyond that to anything that could be general intelligence. And lastly, we have the doomers, the ones that feel that AI will be out of our control and unaligned, and it will eventually kill us all. Getting back to Mark's question about 5 to 10%, possibly. Now, I find this graphic a useful one to keep in mind whenever I'm watching somebody talk about this subject. And I'm always trying to categorize them. I'm trying to put them into one of these groups so that I know where they're coming from. I know what their basic view of this issue is. And then I can discount or I can credit whatever they're saying appropriately. But I think that's kind of a habit I have from some of the work that I used to do. I used to be sent out to different communities and I'd be told to gather intelligence on this or that issue. And it might be technical, it might be, I mean, for example, one of the things that we had when I was working in Toronto was we have all these ethnic communities in Canada, and sometimes they bring their conflicts from wherever they've come with them. And so there's internal fighting and so forth. So I'd be going out and I'd be talking to members of this community, and I'd like to know, well, are you on the government side of this issue, the rebel side, or are you on somebody else's perspective? So it always helped me to kind of categorize things. So it's just a habit that I have. The other habit that we have, and I'm not going to go into this too much today, but I thought this might be interesting to you, is as an intelligence officer, you're always qualifying your sources. And the methodology for this, I don't know if this would be maybe too much for you to use on a regular basis, is we separate out our source from the information. So the source, like if you're talking to Mark about history, I would rate him an A-level source. I'd put him way up there, Mark. Way to go. So anything that he provides me automatically, gets a sort of a high level. But I also have to think about the nature of the information that he's providing me. So Mark may be typically completely reliable, but if he's coming to me with something that isn't typically in his wheelhouse, something not related to history or international relations, then I might have to downgrade it a little bit. Your best source is an A1, your worst one is an E5, and a lot of walk-ins, people that just, you have no history with, you have no way of corroborating what they're saying, they're F6s. This system is used by NATO. It's based on an old British Admiralty code. So again, if you're doing this back in Ottawa, we'd be coding all the information we'd be getting from these AI experts as to, what's their background, what's their knowledge of this particular topic. Just a little bit of an insight or peek behind the scenes there. Let's get back to our grid and go back to that top left corner, the optimists. The optimists would basically argue that AI is the amplifier of human intelligence, that it's going to solve all our hardest problems, it's going to result in near infinite economic wealth and create this post-scarcity society. So not surprising, when you think about national security and geopolitics, the optimists see mainly the positives. They see AI as being able to neutralize all the cyber threats that are out there because it's very good at detecting any anomalies and patterns and so forth. And similar to that, it'll provide early warning of any malicious activity. So if our neighboring country is getting ready to attack us, it'll pick up on the early warning signs, it'll allow us to react. It'll even be able to pick up on the early warning signs of somebody wanting to go into a school and commit a shooting. So it could be that sophisticated. Just on a personal level, I mean, one of the things I had to do as an intelligence officer, as I mentioned before, was go out into these different communities and find people who knew something about the topic and get them to cooperate and so forth. I would love to be working today and have AI to help me filter out a crowd like this and figure out who knew about this topic and what approach I should take with them and so forth. Imagine how much easier my job would be today if I had that tool. There's also a problem in intelligence, in national security, where for the last probably 20 years, we've collected much more than we can actually read. You know, if you think that the classic example here is if you have a drone, a UAV flying over Afghanistan, and it's collecting full motion video, and it's got hundreds of hours, thousands of hours, no human being can sit there and watch all of that and look for any sort of anomalies or changes. AI can do that. So it's helping us with what's called the processing and exploitation problem, the P&E problem. The bottom line here is that it'll enhance our warfighting capability, command and control. It'll allow us to use more autonomous weapons, whether that's good or bad. Target selection, there's a great example from Iran. I don't know if you saw this, but apparently the Americans were able to hit something like 900 targets in the first 12 hours of the war. That's a phenomenal number of targets. That would have required 1,000 analysts to actually do. And AI was able to do that, specifically a program called Maven, built by a company called Palantir. On the geopolitical side, the optimists basically see a lot of positives as well. It'll be shifting power though. I mean, the basis of power in the past has been you have a large population, you have a large economy, you have a large military. Those things might diminish somewhat in importance because with AI, perhaps it's things like the quality or quantity of data that dictates how powerful your country is, or your human talent, your ability to exploit that, to come up with new algorithms, and perhaps your computing infrastructure, the size of it, the speed of it. So under that scenario, the winners in this world will be those that invest in education and who build up their pool of human talent and are able to attract that from all over the world and have the resources to actually build the infrastructure and to run it cheaply using solar power or hydropower to build their and run their data centers. So the big question here with the optimists is what happens to war? Well, they would argue that AI probably makes war less likely. They would say that it can strengthen your ability to deter an enemy from attacking you because you get those early warning indicators and you're able to respond. It would also, if you're in the middle of a crisis, hopefully improve the decision making, make it more objective, be able to take in more data. It might reduce human bias and emotion because the AI won't panic. It won't feel the need for vengeance. In the midst of a crisis, it would be incredibly useful for having an AI that would say, for example, tell you what courses of action are available to you and what their likely outcomes are. So, if I attack Iran, will they blockade the Strait of Hormuz? Big red flag on that one, and you don't do it. Something that doesn't get mentioned a lot, but in most conflicts, when you do reach the stage of a ceasefire or a truce, there's some sort of treaty, and part of that is verification. Well, AI could help ensure that they're not stocking up in their nuclear materials or building new missiles. So in situations where you necessarily can't trust the adversary, the AI could sort of provide at least some measure of transparency. The bottom line here is that according to the optimists, AI will lessen the chance of surprise, misunderstanding, and overreaction. So I'm not saying I buy all that, I'm just saying that's their perspective. There is, of course, another one, the doomers. So they would argue that AI is already being misused. It's already discriminating against people and denying coverage and all kinds of things. And they really worry that super intelligent AI, when that eventually arrives, will be impossible to control. In fact, I don't know if many of you know this, but AI doesn't actually, nobody writes the code for AI. It writes its own code, right? And we put constraints on top of that, filters and so forth, but it's getting more and more complex and less understood. So at the end of the day, it could either intentionally or accidentally destroy humanity. To give you an example, intentionally, it might decide that, hey, I need your atoms, so I'm going to convert you into your constituent components and recycle you to build another AI data center. Or it could decide, hey, you know, I operate more efficiently at lower temperatures, I'm going to lower the temperature of the planet by 20 degrees. And it just wouldn't care that that would wipe out most of, the vegetation and everything that depends on it, including us. One of the things that we have to be careful, though, when we think about doomsday scenarios is we're very influenced by our mythology and our stories. Whether it's Prometheus, who steals fire from the gods and has his liver eaten out every day as a penance, or Icarus flying too close to the sun and having the wax melt his wings, or Frankenstein using electricity to create the monster and then being destroyed by it. We have this sort of built-in sense that sometimes we fly too close to the sun and maybe we should be punished for it. And I think some of that might be going on in the background of AI. We're just worried that this thing could get out of hand like Frankenstein's monster and come back to destroy us. So the reason I mention this is that as an intelligence analyst, you have to be very, very cognizant of your own mindset and bias. Like, am I drifting a certain way because I have a certain way of thinking? And we all have this. It arises because of the type of family we grew up in, the culture that we're in, whether we went to university, where we traveled, our work experience. I work mainly in government, so I have a very government perspective. I have a lot of friends that worked in the military or law enforcement, and those contrasts come about. And it's always interesting. There are downsides to them, because if you're all of a similar mindset, you could suffer from groupthink, where you essentially are like a herd of animals going down the same path. Or mirror imaging, where you think that this is the way I see the world, so it must be the way that they see the world as well. So you don't recognize that they have different motives or different values and would gladly give up a third of their population if they could achieve the same. So, that would be horrific to you, but that makes sense from their perspective. So we have a variety of techniques that we use where we try and shift our mindset, or at least be more aware of it. So what about the doomers? Not surprisingly, when it comes to national security and geopolitics, they're pessimistic. They think that AI could lead to total domestic surveillance. So AI would be able to track every decision you make, every purchase, every eye movement. It would know all of that. And in a worst case scenario, if you had a sort of malicious leader who wanted to create a totalitarian state, it would certainly allow them to do so. While AI could defend against cyber threats, it might also be very inventive in creating new types of cyber threats. And if a government website is probably attacked 1,000 times a day, it could be attacked 100,000 times a day if AI were orchestrating that. We could also expect to see at kind of a lower level personal attacks, very targeted ones. I mean, communication that looks exactly like your son, your daughter, your mother, and they're asking for help or whatever. And it's so real that you can't really tell the difference. Lastly, we could see AI being misused to sort of herd people's opinions in a certain direction. The military term for this is psyops. We know it by more innocuous terms like marketing and advertising and whatever, but think of it this way, it would be super tailored. I mean, the argument they would use with you would be different from the argument they would use with your spouse. And everything you do could be sort of nudged in a particular direction. I mean, if Elon Musk wanted to use Grok to do this, to nudge people towards voting Republican, every little sort of thing that it served up could sort of gradually sort of push you in that direction. And you wouldn't even know that you were being manipulated. So what happens to international relations? Under this doomsday or doomer scenario, we'd probably see a world that didn't involve so much kinetic activity, where we're shooting at each other and firing missiles. We'd probably see more of what's called hybrid warfare. So that's a term that basically means warfare by other means, warfare by sort of less obvious, less intense, low-intensity conflict. So it would involve things like cyber intrusions, disrupting people's power networks, telecommunications. You try and damage their banking system and so forth. So maybe that kind of activity. More use of autonomous weapons. And probably the last bullet point on the left is interesting. You'd probably see some new players emerge in this area, because the traditional centers of power, the large army, the large population, big economy, may not be as important. Maybe here it's innovation. Think of Ukraine. I mean, who would have expected Ukraine would be fighting 4 years on and being so innovative and coming up with anti-drone technology? We could see other smaller states being as innovative and becoming niche players and punching well above their weight. They would argue that war would be more likely because AI would lower the threshold for conflict. The argument here is that if you don't have to put troops at risk, there's not much of a hesitation. Like, what's going to be the blowback? If you have to rescue some hostages or abduct a foreign leader, you're going to have to put Canadians or Americans at risk to do that. If on the other hand, you could just send a UAV in to do the work, well, it may be a lot easier to commit that kind of act. We could have what's called a flash war, a war that's over in 2 minutes, a war that happened so fast that no human being was able to sort of monitor or intercede. Where our system detected an attack, it responded, the other system detected our response, they responded, and the whole thing was finished before we even knew what happened. With all the deep fakes and AI propaganda out there, that may muddy the waters so much that we don't even know what our adversaries are up to. I mean, it's hard enough to know today, but in the future that may even be more difficult. And having an AI arms race, where, let's say, we're concerned about our adversaries, say China developing an AI, we may feel that they're getting ahead too fast, and we may need to make a preemptive strike to neutralize their capability to get even further ahead. So you can see the thinking that goes on in the doomer mindset here. The bottom line is that conflict becomes easier to start and harder to control. So I've talked about the best scenario, I've talked kind of about the worst. I'll just finish up with the two other ones that we brought up when we created our 4 quadrants. The ethicists are the ones that basically feel that, it's kind of a double-edged sword. There are benefits that come with this technology, but there are also hazards. So who gets to benefit and who bears the cost? So they would bring this AI safety issue up, and they would wonder if we could build adequate safety guardrails. Probably the most interesting guy you could listen to on this topic is Yuval Harari, the gentleman on the far right. I find every time I listen to one of his lectures, it's just, my mind is blown. So for the ethicists, again, these are the people that see sort of the two sides of the coin. They would think that, well, yeah, it's great that you have AI to improve your intelligence gathering and your war fighting, but it's going to likely come with less human oversight. And that could be a bad thing, because we might escalate into a situation without really realizing what was happening. We could become AI dependent. We could lose human expertise. I mean, right now we have enough experts that if the AI says, this is a danger, this is a threat, somebody could question that. I kind of wonder what happens in 10 years. Will we still have that level of expertise that can actually question the AI? Digital sovereignty is kind of a big issue too for the ethicists. Like, once you create these things and you upload all this data to a cloud, who has access to it? Is it right for Americans to be able to know everything they can about Canadians? And would that allow them to manipulate us more effectively if they had access to that information? Over on the geopolitical side, basically, the ethicists would argue that this technology is going to make strong states stronger, which could be good, it could be bad, but it also would probably result in some newcomers, which could be interesting. And it would probably also strengthen competition for things like critical minerals and so forth. So maybe create new areas of conflict. The last one I wanted to talk to you about were the skeptics. These were the ones that felt that AI was a bubble, that it's never going to achieve everything that's promised. And I think it's always good to keep this hype curve in mind. Whenever you're talking about new technology, there's always this early phase where everybody has great hopes and expectations, right? And you see lots of magazine covers and TED Talks and all kinds of things. And ultimately it gets to a point where people realize, well, it can't quite perform or do everything that we think it can do. There's a lot of sort of constraints and bottlenecks, and that sort of crashes. And then eventually we figure out, well, we can get parts of this to work, and maybe we can do this with it rather than that, and it finds an equilibrium. And I think AI is probably just cresting that top at this point. So for the skeptics, they would say that AI, yeah, it'll be a tool, it'll be used, but it'll be used judiciously, it'll be used carefully, because we won't trust it entirely. The example I put up here was that girls' school in Iran that got targeted. So yes, it's remarkable that the Americans could hit 900 targets in 12 hours, but they also had instances like this girls' school that was destroyed. We'll have a lot of false positives, a lot of spurious correlations that we'll have to sort out. I was talking to some of my analyst friends, and they say, yeah, I'm going to be babysitting an AI for the next 10 years, you know, just making sure that it's not coming up with something that's crazy and, you know, weird, like, you know, all terrorists wear shoes, this person wears shoes, therefore she's a terrorist kind of thing, right? It could make those kinds of connections, and then a human would have to come in and say, no, that's not really consequential. So in the best case for the skeptics, AI comes out and it becomes a tool that we use, but it's one that is used sort of as an assistant. So we're hybrids, we're centaurs. The worst case scenario here, there's a guy named Cory Doctorow who writes about technology, and he feels that doctors who use AI, lawyers, accountants, whatever, the AI will be doing like 99% of the work, and they'll just keep the human around as a scapegoat in case the AI makes a mistake. So you have somebody to blame and sue, right? So that could be an issue. On the geopolitical side, you know, if the AI bubble pops, it could certainly cause a lot of economic, you know, chaos. And I think that could also be a bit destabilizing. Where, you know, it might play an outsized role is if you have a country that's able to take this technology and to do something significant with it, like, I don't know, make a breakthrough in materials science, you know, they could become disproportionately influential in the world. The example I thought of was Denmark and Ozempic, and the fact that they're like 4% of their GDP now or something like that. So if AI can help you make a breakthrough drug or a material that's superconducting at room temperature, you know, then suddenly your country becomes incredibly powerful. I'm going to finish with 5 scenarios. What I've talked about so far, I was a little worried might be a bit too abstract. So I wanted to bring it down to something that we could all relate to. And I thought, you know, whether you're a pessimist, an optimist, a doomer, whatever, I think most of them would agree that eventually AI will cause unemployment. And we'll start small and we'll grow over time. And I think it's interesting to talk about how that will disrupt society and what that means for the potential for conflict. So I'm going to run you through these 5 scenarios, and then I'm done. Now, one of the things that we do as analysts, before we get too far into our topic, is we like to make some assumptions. And usually this is a practical thing, because otherwise you go off in all kinds of directions. You can make some assumptions, and that sort of simplifies the matters. There's less discussion, if you will. Let's assume, for the purposes of our discussion today, that AI chips will continue to improve. So they've been ramping up, and that curve will continue. That regulation by the government will remain permissive. That development cycles, you know, the next version of ChatGPT and so forth, will continue to accelerate. And that companies that are using AI are able to lower costs and increase productivity. There's been some sort of mixed results on that so far, but let's say they get beyond those growing pains and eventually it really starts to bite in. And not only does that help those companies, the ones that aren't doing it, that aren't keeping up, are starting to fall behind and get desperate, so they're having to jump on the bandwagon. Those first 4 bullet points all mean AI taking over human jobs. The last point, the last assumption, is really the most critical, because that's the one that means basically once you're out of the job you're in currently, there's nowhere else for you to go. In previous situations like the Industrial Revolution, if you were making buggy whips, right, and they brought cars in and they didn't need buggy whips anymore, you could go and you could make wheels for the new cars and things like that. People are saying that there's no higher ground to move to after AI takes these jobs. So that's a critical assumption. Now you can disagree with me. You can say, well, John, no, number 3, I don't like that, and so forth. But just for the purposes of our discussion, grant me that, we'll make these assumptions. This sort of thing is also a technique that analysts do all the time. We're very, very concerned about the assumptions we're making. So we always go through, we identify them, we try and list them out just as I did. We try and sort of eliminate anything that we can confirm or disconfirm so we don't have to assume it. We'll make sure that if it was true in the past, it's still true today. We'll assess how much impact that assumption has on our bottom line conclusion, and we'll revise our assumptions as new information comes in. So let's look at our 5 scenarios. We've got the first scenario, 10% unemployment probably happening within the next 2 years. We hit 25% unemployment by 2032. I've called that situation turmoil and civil unrest. Gets really bad by 2040 when we hit 50% unemployment. That's a crisis. I've called 75% unemployment the interregnum because that's a period of transition. And finally, the last stage, 95% unemployment, it's a totally different world. So in my last slide, what I've tried to do is sort of condense down and give you a picture of what each one of those places looks like. Starting with 10% unemployment. It's not all that different from the world we have today. Unemployment is currently around, 4 or 5%, so this is only about double what we have now. On the positive side, by 2028, 2 years from now, AI has optimized almost everything. Logistics, plane reservations, medical appointments, whatever you want to think about. AI has figured out how to do that more efficiently, and there's less food waste. All these other positives are starting to accrue, and we're getting more electricity out of our grid, we're managing it more effectively, all these great things. But it has become very difficult to find a job, and this is, I think, already true for a lot of people graduating today. Very difficult to find an entry-level job. On the negative side also, virtually everything we do is now being captured somewhere. And not only captured, which was true in the past, but now it can be exploited, it can be used, it can be read, it can be used to help influence the next thing that we do, or predict it. In this sort of immediate future, I think we'll see more of that hybrid warfare that I talked about earlier. That's where we have these low-intensity conflicts. We're not necessarily fighting with tanks and planes, but we're fighting with our networks against each other. We're trying to probe for vulnerabilities. We're trying to disrupt their ability to manufacture things through corrupting data files or disrupting electrical grids, that kind of thing. And we're seeing a lot more use of autonomous weapon systems. And this is already happening. The Pentagon is giving out billions to companies like Anduril to develop AWS. What about 6 years from now? What about by 2032? It's quite possible we could hit 25% unemployment by then. By the way, the way I came up with these numbers was I went to Google Gemini and I said, what's the consensus on when we hit 25% unemployment? So again, you could quibble with me about, well, I think it could be earlier, John, or I think it might take later. But really the point is not to think too much about the time frame, but everybody would agree that at some point in time, we're likely to hit these benchmarks, right? 10%, 25%, 50%, and so forth. Whether it's sooner or later, we can debate, but it's interesting to think about the type of world that would exist at that point in time. So the good news here is that within the next 6 years, we'll be huge beneficiaries because there'll be all kinds of breakthroughs. I mean, the stuff that they're working on now with protein folding and all that sort of stuff, there'll be actually new drugs coming out, new diagnostic techniques. We'll be beneficiaries of that. So that's great stuff. But on the other hand, there'll be no safe career at this point. All the careers that were automated in the first 2 years were sort of the easy pickings. Now it's starting to get into the more sophisticated stuff. And that's taking away jobs from sort of higher end white-collar workers. This could be a future by 2032 where we see UI coverage evolving into more of a universal basic income. Corporate profits for some companies could be falling by this point because as people become unemployed and they're able to spend less, there's less money to be made, so those companies could be suffering. On the other hand, the AI companies are doing great, so that's a real difference. One of the interesting points that could happen within the next 6 years is AI is becoming legal persons. So I don't know how many of you know this, but there's a thing where corporations are considered persons under the law. It's so that they can hold property and be sued, they can be liable for things and so forth. So it's a bit of a legal fiction, but it's quite conceivable that AIs could obtain some of those rights as well. And that would be very interesting. That guy I mentioned earlier, Yuval Harari, he says, just imagine an immensely smart AI that lives forever and the wealth that it could accumulate. Question?
The universal basic income card.
Yeah.
That's the finance or not?
Yes, I was going to get to that in a second.
Us finally implementing a machine tax?
Yeah, I think that's quite likely. So, although some corporate profits are falling, it's quite possible the government would turn to the AI companies and apply some sort of additional tax to what they're doing, or even companies using AI may have to pay some additional tax in order to fund the UBI benefits. It's interesting, and Joanna would probably talk to this point. She was the one talking in the last session about ethical consideration. This could be a society where we're starting to see some really significant impacts on human connection. I mean, think about people growing up where AI was not only your companion, your mentor, your advisor, your closest friend, right? What that does to having actual human connections and whether or not people would be able to relate to each other, in the far future. This 25% unemployment would likely be a period of time with a lot of civil unrest. So we'd see a lot of churn, I think, in politics. It could also be a time when terrorists are exploiting AI to create chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons. So those things are difficult to build, but easier if you have AI to do so. So we could see more sophisticated attacks from extremist groups. At the end of this period, some people think we'll have artificial general intelligence. So that's, rather than the niche-specific diagnosing thing that looks for breast cancer or optimizes airline schedules or whatever, this is something that approaches a human in terms of its flexibility to deal with a diverse range of problems. But there are others that debate that it's going to take a bit longer. Now we get into a bit of a darker period. At 50% unemployment, that's more unemployment than we've ever had. During the Great Depression, they estimate we had about 20% unemployment. 50% unemployment would be a whole new ballpark. Those that have adapted and maybe found themselves by fortuitous chance in a good place might see a very comfortable lifestyle as a new leisure class. Human labor would be considered a luxury good. A lot of companies at this point would be struggling to stay in business, and we could see a lot of them being nationalized and taken over by the government and run that way if there's still a reason to keep them going. This could also be a period where we descend into a very dark kind of authoritarian regime because we're desperate. Things aren't working. Things are starting to fall apart. We're turning to powerful men and women to guide us through this. So we're a bit desperate and we're seeking those leaders, and they're ruling by oppression and repression. So this could be a period of time where everybody would be keeping their heads down, just trying to survive. We could see a lot of economic refugees. If our UBI system here in Canada was working well, we might be able to take care of ourselves. But if it wasn't working well in some other country, they might be trying to escape there and come here. And so we have a lot of those types of issues to deal with. And this could also be a period of time where the AIs have been given full authority, full autonomy over our defensive weapon systems, and the possibility of a flash war has increased. If it weren't bad enough, by 2050, within about 34 years, we could hit 75% unemployment. One of the readers one of the experts that I consulted on this said that could actually be a good world, John, because by that point, AI has infiltrated so much that it has such pervasive knowledge that nobody can inscribe anymore. I mean, we're almost there today with the phones we have in our pockets. You know, it's pretty hard to commit a crime without giving away where you were, and if the car was stolen or broken into or the person murdered, they kind of know everybody who was in the vicinity, they have witnesses, they can check, cameras and so forth. Think of, in a few more years, that capacity will be 100 times what it is today. Anyway, this period I've called the interregnum because that was the term they used when one emperor died and before a new emperor ascended the throne. So it was a time of confusion, a transition time. And this is where the social fabric could be in tatters, our regimes could be sort of questioned, and we could have lost faith in them, and our institutions could be collapsed. So this would be a very dark time to be alive and try and live. People would be searching desperately for some meaning, might be a turn to mysticism. All warfare at this point would be network-centric, so it would all be conducted online. Why attack an enemy with missiles when you can turn off their missile control systems or influence their population not to build the missiles in the first place? So this would be a very different world than what we're used to. This could also be the point in time where we see artificial superintelligence evolve. And our last scenario, if we manage to get through all of that, we get to this post-scarcity society where there's no more human suffering because the machines have built everything. Basically, all wants are met. We don't have a need for the military anymore. There's no more conflict. It's all rainbows and unicorns. However, there is some doubt about who's actually in control at this point, whether it's us or the robot overlords. So there, in very condensed fashion, is kind of a layout of what our world could look like at different levels of AI-caused unemployment. It's, to sum up, kind of good for the first few years, but then it goes through a very dark period before coming out the other end. I'll sort of end on this point, and it's always something that I try to remind the analysts that I was teaching or working with, that we know certain things. So there are known knowns, facts that we can agree on. There are also known unknowns, gaps in our knowledge, questions we have to answer. But there are these unknown unknowns. These are the things that are kind of lurking in the dark, things we don't know to worry about yet. And there could be a lot of those, particularly in this. So I think we should take all of this with a bit of a grain of salt and maybe hope for the best, but who knows what's in those dark shadows. The last thing I'll end on is this reference. I thought you might find this interesting. We're talking about AI today, which is that red circle in the middle. What this is an interesting graphic of the things that are disrupting our world. And on the bottom is the likelihood, and on the vertical axis is the impact. So the things in the top right corner are the things that have the biggest impact and most likely to occur. So they've got a variety of things, which I won't go into today on this thing, but very few people know about Policy Horizons Canada, and it's our strategic intelligence unit out of Ottawa. And they put these things out publicly. So if you're interested in sort of zooming out and getting a broader perspective on all the things that could disrupt our world, I encourage you to read that. With that, I am done. Thank you very much.